More than 2,500 years ago, in the wine-dark waters of the Aegean Sea, there was an island unlike any other. It was not Athens, the city of philosophers, nor Sparta, the land of warriors. This was Lesbos, a small, sunlit island of olive trees, marble temples, and a secret. Here, poetry was power. Lesbos in the 7th century BCE wasn't just a dot on the map of ancient Greece. It was a cultural hub, a place where art and intellect thrived far from the chaos of warring city-states. Wealth from trade poured into its harbors, and aristocratic families invested that wealth not only in politics but in culture. Music wasn't a hobby here. It was a language, a status symbol, and for some, a spiritual calling. And it was in this world that Sappho was born. We know frustratingly little about her early life. Even her birth year is a mystery. Scholars estimate she lived sometime around 630 BCE, but exact dates are lost in the fog of history. What we do know is that she grew up in a society unlike most of ancient Greece. Women in Athens, for instance, were often secluded in silence. On Lesbos, aristocratic women could be educated, could play music, could compose poetry, and in rare cases like Sappho's, they could achieve immortality through art. Picture the island in her time, narrow streets paved with stone, lined with homes that overlooked the glimmering Aegean Sea. In the courtyards, lyres hummed softly in the afternoon sun, their sound carrying through marble colonnades. Poetry wasn't written to be read silently. It was meant to be sung. Every word Sappho ever wrote was music first, poetry second. But Lesbos was more than a cultural haven. It was also politically turbulent. Factional disputes rocked the island, leading to power struggles between noble families. At one point, Sappho herself is said to have been exiled, a poet forced from her homeland. The fragments of her poetry echo this unrest, longing, separation, a yearning for something beautiful in the midst of chaos. This was the crucible in which she was forged, a poet living at the edge of history on an island where women could be heard, but where danger and instability simmered beneath the surface. And yet, despite the wars, the rivalries, in the centuries that would come to bury her work, the name Sappho of Lesbos would rise higher than kings or generals. Even in her lifetime, she was called the 10th Muse, as if the gods themselves had chosen her to walk among mortals. But here's the thing, for all her fame, all her acclaim, we know almost nothing about her. Who was she? What inspired her words? And why did so much of her work vanish into dust and fire? To answer that, we need to go deeper, not just into her poetry, but into the woman behind the legend. There are women in history whose names survive, but whose faces have been completely erased. Sappho is one of them. We know her voice, intimate, powerful, piercing across millennia. But her life is a puzzle of scattered fragments, rumors, and whispers. Even the ancient Greeks who revered her left us no definitive biography. Her birth year? Unknown. Her death? Shrouded in myth. Even the details of her family are like faded ink on ancient papyrus. We think her father's name was Scamandronymus, or maybe Eurygus, or maybe he never existed at all. Ancient writers couldn't agree. Some claimed she had brothers, others denied it. The fragments of her life are so contradictory that every historian reconstructs a different woman. And maybe that's the most haunting thing about her. For someone who was celebrated in her own lifetime, Sappho feels like a ghost. What we do know is that she lived on the island of Lesbos in the 7th to 6th century BCE, a time when Greek city-states were rising and falling like waves on the Aegean. She was likely born into an aristocratic family. Wealth and privilege would explain her education and her access to music, literature, and the instruments she so masterfully used. But even privilege couldn't protect her from politics. Ancient sources hint that she and her family were caught in a power struggle on Lesbos, forcing her into exile. She may have spent time in Sicily, a fact that later Roman writers romanticized, imagining her writing her most emotional poems while wandering foreign shores. What's strange is that Sappho wasn't forgotten like most ancient poets. She wasn't obscure. She was legendary. She was so famous that statues were erected in her honor. Philosophers like Plato called her the 10th Muse, placing her above mortal poets and alongside the divine goddesses of inspiration. Her works filled 9 volumes in the Great Library of Alexandria, shelves of lyric poetry that entire generations memorized and performed. And yet, those shelves are gone. Those scrolls have crumbled. The woman who was worshipped in her time is now known through fewer than 700 surviving lines of poetry, scraps and fragments, many discovered not in libraries, but in the dust of ancient garbage dumps in Egypt. How does someone so monumental vanish almost completely? Was it time, neglect, or something darker, an act of deliberate erasure? Before we unravel that mystery, we need to step into the heart of Sappho's world, her circle of women, her art, and her influence, which would ripple through centuries like a song carried on the wind. To imagine Sappho, we have to imagine her world, not a solitary poet scribbling in isolation, but the center of a vibrant circle of voices, a sanctuary of music, poetry, and intimacy. This was not a classroom nor a temple. It was something more mysterious and far more powerful. Historians often call it a school, but that word feels too formal. Sappho's gatherings were closer to a salon, an exclusive circle of aristocratic women bound together by shared education, music, and culture. In a time when women's lives were largely defined by marriage and domestic duty, this circle offered something radical, a space where women's voices mattered. Imagine the scene, the salty breeze from the Aegean drifting through open courtyards, the hum of stringed instruments, and voices weaving words into melodies. Lyric poetry wasn't just recited, it was performed. Each poem was meant to be sung, often accompanied by the lyre or barbitos, instruments Sappho mastered. Her verses weren't dry literature. They were alive, musical, and deeply emotional. This is why Sappho's poetry feels so intimate. Unlike epic poets like Homer, who wrote of gods and wars, Sappho wrote in the first person, often addressing someone directly. She wrote about love, longing, desire, heartbreak, and the fleeting beauty of life. Themes that feel astonishingly modern. Sweet mother, I cannot weave. Slender Aphrodite has overcome me with longing for a girl. Fragment 102. Lines like these, preserved in fragile papyrus fragments, give us a glimpse into her world. Her poetry doesn't just describe love. It captures its weight, its urgency, its power to shake a person to their core. Sappho's circle of women wasn't just a casual group of friends. It was a cultural institution. Young women of noble families came to Lesbos to study under her, to learn the art of poetry, music, and refined speech. In a society where reputation and eloquence were crucial, Sappho's mentorship shaped future leaders and wives of influential men. But more importantly, it created a safe space where women could explore ideas and emotions freely. And this intimacy, this raw honesty, is what made her work revolutionary. Sappho stripped away the heroic mass of Greek literature and spoke with a voice that was personal, vulnerable, and deeply human. Some scholars have even argued that Sappho's circle functioned like a kind of spiritual sisterhood, dedicated to the goddess Aphrodite. Her poems are filled with invocations to the goddess of love, treating love itself as a divine force. To the Greeks, this wasn't scandalous. It was art. But centuries later, her unapologetic celebration of love between women would be used to tarnish her reputation. What's fascinating is that this house of women became so legendary that it shaped how later generations viewed Lesbos itself. Over time, the word lesbian came to be associated with same-sex love between women, a linguistic legacy that began with Sappho's poems and her island home. But in her lifetime, she wasn't a symbol or an icon. She was a working poet, crafting songs that could bring kings to tears, that could immortalize moments of tenderness, and that could make her name echo for centuries. Yet even at the height of her fame, Sappho's life was shadowed by political turmoil. She was reportedly exiled, torn from her community, forced to leave Lesbos behind. Imagine the pain of losing not just your home, but the circle of voices that gave your art life. That exile adds a melancholy undertone to her surviving verses. She wrote not from comfort, but from a world where beauty and loss constantly collided. And maybe that's why her words still cut so deeply. They come from a woman who lived with one foot in greatness and the other in tragedy. Sappho wasn't simply a poet. She was a cultural force. Her House of Women wasn't just a gathering, it was a movement, one that would ripple through art and language for millennia. But what truly set her apart wasn't her fame or her influence. It was her poetry itself. So exquisite, so precise that even in fragments, it feels alive. To understand her fully, we need to step inside her art. Imagine if the works of Shakespeare, Mozart, and Picasso were almost entirely lost. If all that remained of their genius were scraps, a single torn page, a faded note. That's Sappho, a woman whose name was once spoken with reverence, whose poetry could move an entire city to tears, now survives in just fragments. Yet even those fragments are breathtaking. Sappho didn't write epic sagas of gods and warriors. She wasn't interested in cataloging history or glorifying kings. Her poetry was something far rarer in ancient Greece, lyric poetry. Lyric poetry wasn't written for distant readers. It was composed to be performed, sung aloud, accompanied by the lyre, each word carefully chosen to flow with music. Her poems weren't monuments. They were moments, flashes of emotion crystallized into verse. And unlike the heroic tales of Homer, Sappho's verses were deeply personal. They spoke of love, heartbreak, jealousy, longing, and the fleeting beauty of life. She didn't write for kings. She wrote for you, the listener, making her poetry feel startlingly modern even after 2,500 years. Take, for example, her most famous surviving piece, Ode to Aphrodite. It is the only one of her works that has survived in its entirety. Come to me now once again and release me from harsh anxiety. All that my heart longs to accomplish. You, be my ally. This isn't a distant prayer, it's an urgent plea. Sappho writes to the goddess of love like an old friend, asking her for help in the throes of desire. She strips away formality and grandeur, replacing it with raw intimacy. And that's the secret of her genius. Sappho made poetry human. Her style was deceptively simple. Each word was chosen with surgical precision. She often wrote in the Sapphic stanza, a rhythm so unique it still carries her name today. Her verses were full of sensory imagery, the sound of laughter, the smell of garlands, the warmth of sunlight. She wrote emotions you could touch. But there's something even more fascinating about Sappho's work. Much of it is lost. So what survives are fragments, pieces torn from scrolls, single lines quoted by ancient scholars, scraps of papyrus dug up in Egyptian trash heaps. These fragments create a haunting effect. For instance, one reads, "When I answered her, 'Go and be happy.' That's all we have. No context, no resolution. Just a voice echoing from 2,500 years ago. And yet, it's powerful. These scraps feel almost like glimpses of a ghost. Centuries after her death, Roman poets like Catullus and Horace idolized her. Even Plato himself declared that Sappho is not a mortal woman, but a divine muse. To be compared to the goddesses of inspiration was the highest praise imaginable. And Sappho earned it. But not everyone celebrated her. By the Christian era, her unapologetic exploration of love, especially love between women, became controversial. Her work was often censored, ignored, or destroyed, perhaps deliberately. Entire volumes vanished. The fact that we have any of her work today is a miracle. Her poetry has been described as immortal fragments, and that phrase feels perfect. Even a single line of hers carries an entire world. And maybe that's why she continues to fascinate us, because her voice is both present and absent, alive and lost. But Sappho wasn't just a poet of love. She was a poet of power. Her influence shaped the very language of desire, redefining how poetry could express emotion. And her fame was so great that it became inseparable from her personal life. And that's where the myths begin. Because for centuries, people have asked, who did Sappho love? Who did she write for? And why has her story been twisted into legend? To answer that, we step into one of the most controversial and misunderstood chapters of her life. For thousands of years, one question has followed Sappho's name like a shadow. Who did she love? Was she a teacher, a lover, a priestess, or something far more complicated? The truth is, no one really knows. And that mystery has haunted her story for centuries. Sappho's poems are deeply intimate, filled with longing and passion, but they rarely name the objects of her affection. Instead, she writes in fragments of desire, the curve of a smile, the sound of laughter, the agony of jealousy. One of her most famous fragments describes the physical effect of seeing someone she loves. When I look at you, even a moment, no speaking is left in me. No, tongue breaks and thin fire is racing under skin. This poem is over 2,500 years old, yet it reads like a diary entry from today. It's not grand or formal, it's human, it's real, and its intimacy is part of what has made Sappho's sexuality a topic of fascination for centuries. Many scholars believe that Sappho openly expressed love for women. Her poems often praise female beauty in language so tender, so passionate, that later generations found it scandalous. The very term lesbian derives from her home island of Lesbos and sapphic from her own name. But not everyone was comfortable with this image. Ancient writers and later historians tried to rewrite her story. Some claimed she was simply a teacher, and her verses were just exercises in mentorship. Others invented entirely new legends to reshape her image, none more famous than the tale of Phaon. According to this legend, Sappho fell hopelessly in love with a young ferryman named Phaon. When he rejected her, she threw herself off a cliff in despair. It's a tragic image, but there's just one problem. There's no evidence it ever happened. Most historians now believe this was propaganda created centuries after her death, a way for later writers to heterosexualize her, painting her as a heartbroken woman obsessed with a man. This myth was so powerful that Renaissance painters immortalized it, and romantic poets repeated it endlessly. The image of Sappho as the broken-hearted suicide overshadowed the real woman, a brilliant poet whose life was far more complex. Why was there such an effort to rewrite her? Perhaps because Sappho represented something revolutionary, a woman whose voice could rival men, who wrote openly of love between women, and whose fame was so vast that she could not simply be erased. She had to be reshaped. And that's the tragedy of Sappho's legacy. For centuries, people have been less interested in who she really was and more interested in who they wanted her to be. To the Greeks, she was a muse. To the Romans, a seductive poetess. To medieval Christians, she was a sinner. To modern readers, she is a queer icon. But the truth is that Sappho transcends all these labels. Her poetry wasn't just about gender or politics. It was about the universal experience of desire, that burning, unstoppable feeling that has haunted humanity since the dawn of time. Still, the rewriting of her life story may hold a darker clue, because along with her image, her work also began to disappear. And that disappearance has its own mystery, one that has fueled endless speculation. 9 volumes. That's what Sappho left behind. 9 entire volumes of poetry, preserved in the legendary Library of Alexandria. 9 scrolls containing hundreds of songs that made her one of the most celebrated poets in the ancient world. Today, we have fewer than 700 lines. The rest is gone. How does that happen? How does one of the greatest poets of all time vanish almost completely? The story is a mystery and a tragedy. Some blame time itself. Ancient manuscripts were fragile, written on papyrus, which crumbles after centuries if not constantly recopied. Copying manuscripts was expensive and laborious, so if a poet fell out of fashion, their work could disappear simply because no one bothered to rewrite it. Others blame politics and morality. By the Byzantine era, when Christianity had become the dominant force in the Mediterranean, Sappho's poems, filled with erotic imagery, hymns to pagan gods, and expressions of same-sex love, were considered dangerous, even immoral. Some scholars believe her works may have been deliberately destroyed or censored, erased from cultural memory in an age that sought to sanitize history. And then there's the Library of Alexandria itself, the great storehouse of ancient knowledge where her 9 volumes were said to reside. Over centuries, this library suffered fires, invasions, and neglect, each catastrophe erasing countless works of antiquity. By the time the medieval world rose, Sappho's poems were gone, save for scraps preserved by chance. Imagine it, an entire voice, once hailed as divine, reduced to fragments no larger than a torn receipt. That's Sappho's legacy, not because she wasn't great, but because greatness doesn't guarantee survival. And yet, in a twist worthy of a mystery novel, her voice began to return, thousands of years later. In the 19th and 20th centuries, archaeologists digging in Egypt made a startling discovery: pieces of papyrus in ancient garbage dumps. These scraps had been preserved by the desert climate, buried in sand for centuries. Among them were lines of poetry signed by Sappho's name. Since then, fragments have surfaced in private collections, on forgotten parchment, even sold at auctions. In 2014, scholars revealed an almost complete poem, one not seen since antiquity, dubbed the Brothers Poem. The thrill of discovery was electric. For a moment it felt like Sappho was speaking to us directly again, after 2,600 years of silence. This strange resurrection has made her one of the most tantalizing figures in history. No other poet has had such an enormous influence with so little surviving work. She is at once a towering giant of literature and a ghost. But her disappearance isn't just a tragedy, it's a symbol. Sappho's erasure reflects how easily voices, especially women's voices, can vanish from history. Her rediscovery shows how fragile cultural memory really is. One fire, one regime change, one generation of neglect can erase entire worlds. And yet, even through centuries of censorship, neglect, and decay, Sappho endured. Her words, delicate as butterfly wings, survived wars and plagues, and now she is read and celebrated more than she ever was in her own time. But Sappho's story doesn't end with her rediscovery. In fact, the mystery of her disappearance only made her more legendary. Over time, she became more than just a poet. She became a symbol of art, of desire, and of rebellion against a world that tried to erase her. In life, Sappho was a poet. In death, she became a myth. And over the centuries, her ghost refused to fade. For more than 2 millennia, Sappho's name lingered like a whisper. Even when her work vanished, her legend didn't. Ancient writers still spoke of her as one of the greatest poets who ever lived. A 10th Muse, elevated to the same divine status as the goddesses of inspiration. Greek philosophers quoted her lines. Roman poets modeled their verses after her. Catullus, Ovid, and Horace, names carved into the canon of Western literature, all drank from the well of her genius. Even with so few words of hers surviving, her influence shaped the very language of poetry itself. During the Renaissance, Sappho's name rose again. Scholars and artists, hungry for the wisdom of antiquity, began searching for her lost verses. Painters imagined her as a tragic muse, her mythic leap from the cliff for Phaon becoming a popular motif. Ironically, this legend, though false, ensured her fame, making her one of the most painted and romanticized figures in Western art. But as time passed, her story took on another layer of meaning. In the 19th and 20th centuries, Sappho became a symbol of queer identity. Her open expressions of love for women, scandalous to some in earlier centuries, became a source of pride and empowerment. The word sapphic, once whispered as a euphemism, was reclaimed as a celebration of women loving women. The term lesbian itself traces its roots directly to her home island of Lesbos. Sappho, who wrote of longing and tenderness with such universality, became an icon for a movement she never could have imagined. A voice of love that transcended centuries, empires, and prejudice. And yet her story is also a cautionary tale. The loss of her 9 volumes is a reminder of how fragile history can be, and how easily even the greatest voices can be silenced. But her survival, through fragments buried in the sand, scraps quoted by scholars, and myths that kept her name alive, is nothing short of miraculous. It's poetic, really, that a poet who wrote so beautifully about love and longing would herself become longed for by history, Each new fragment of her poetry is like a message in a bottle, drifting across 26 centuries to reach us. Modern scholars treat every new discovery of her work like treasure. Each fragment feels like a heartbeat from the ancient world, proof that while empires fall and cultures vanish, art can still find a way to endure. Today, Sappho is read not just as a historical curiosity, but as a timeless poet. Her verses still appear in anthologies, university syllabi, and even music and film. She continues to inspire poets, artists, and activists, not just for her words, but for her courage. A woman whose voice survived in a world that tried to erase her. But maybe what makes Sappho most powerful is her mystery. We will never know her full story. We will never have all her poems. She will always be in some way incomplete, a puzzle that resists solving. And that's why she remains unforgettable. This is all that remains. A few hundred lines, a handful of verses, a name carved into history, and an echo. Sappho's story is not like other ancient legends. We know almost nothing about her face, her voice, her life, and yet across 2.5 millennia, she still feels alive. Not because of statues or myths, but because of her words. She didn't write for kings or conquerors. She wrote for individuals, for lovers, for friends, for strangers who would never meet her. Her poetry was not meant to be monumental, yet it became immortal. And maybe that's the irony of Sappho. Her absence is part of her power. Each missing line makes the fragments we have more precious. Every scrap of papyrus feels like a whisper from the ancient world, an intimate voice breaking through time. In a way, her disappearance mirrors the lives she wrote about. Beauty, love, desire, all fleeting, all fragile. And yet, in their impermanence, they become eternal. The fact that we know her name at all is a miracle. That she continues to inspire artists, scholars, and millions of readers is proof of something greater. That art can survive even when history tries to silence it. That a woman's voice once heard can echo across centuries. Louder than empires, louder than fire. Sappho of Lesbos remains one of the most influential poets who ever lived. Yet she is also a ghost, a reminder of how much has been lost and how much still waits to be found. And perhaps that's the final gift she left us. A lesson that some voices are too powerful to die. Someone, I tell you, will remember us.